everybody. I'm going to talk about AppSec tooling today. I'm going to talk about the selection process, procurement process, and implementation. So you're going to see this slide quite a bit throughout the conference, but I also wanted to add a little bit of my disclaimer. These are things, so what we're going to be talking about is a very process-oriented thing. So, like AppSec tooling, selection, procurement, and implementation, there are some common patterns that you'll notice once you do these things. But for the most part, this is from what I have gathered through my experience and the experience of my peers. Therefore, we're going to go through 5 different steps here. We're going to understand the need and the landscape of our problem statement, the vendor evaluation and selection process, the procurement and preparations process, the implementation and rollout process, and then afterwards we're going to talk a little bit about operationalization and metrics. So first off, let's talk about the need and the landscape. So I started in a humble AppSec team with big dreams. Many tech stacks were accumulated through M&As over the years, and there is a need to establish a unified application security program. So that's where we began. Now picture this in your head. Your goal is to implement application security tooling, whether that be open source or proprietary. Your budget, you still need to determine your needs to determine and request the budget. So this one is still a blank field. And for your tech stack, you don't necessarily know it yet because you need to figure it out. So our first step is to understand what's out there. That means looking to understand the tech stack, including tools that already exist in your environment. And when it comes to doing this research, understanding what's out there, some of the people that might be helping you along the way would be liaisons. And what that basically means is that you'd be speaking with engineering, legal, finance. There's different stakeholders that do help you in your role in application security. You might run across them through org charts, looking at the team wiki, Workday, asking around, networking, and really all of this stuff, you'll find them out eventually, and it does require you to do a little bit of homework, and I'll get to that in a second. So these are some examples of liaisons. Some liaisons would help organize the work that you do with another team. So for example, another team's TPM, another one would be a manager of the other team you need to work with. The person from the other team who's an IC, and your engineers would be working more directly with them. And then lastly, there are so many other folks along the way that might be a good example of a liaison as well. So don't limit yourself to just the ICs or the managers. There are some people along the way, they might not necessarily be part of the immediate team, but also be very helpful in establishing these relationships with the other teams. So here are some tips on how to engage with them. Have a clear picture of what you need from them before you engage. Or you can probably say, hi, later on, we might talk some more, but basically, you want to establish rapport. And once you engage with them, you want to have that list of questions that you want answered, because you don't want to waste their time. They might be busy folks, but in some cases, depending on how you establish your relationship with them, maybe you become friends along the way, then you can talk a little bit more. Also, here's a really important thing about doing your homework, as I said so last few slides. Try to answer the questions yourself. The really important thing here is that you show them how earnest you are when it comes to your research and the fact that you want to help them. You can build credibility this way for your research. So afterwards, you present your need, questions, and preliminary research with them, and then later on, you can continue this relationship. So now that we've gone through that, it's time to do the fun part, shopping around for vendors. So in our experience, usually there is a discovery call that happens, a couple of demos here and there. Depending on who was in the last demo, you might need someone else to be in the second half of the demo. And then there is the MNDA that needs to get signed. Sometimes it's redlined and negotiated as well. So you want to take that into account when you're filling out your MNDAs. And then do a proof of concept that usually happens as well if you want to proceed forward, and then so on and so forth. And we'll get through the other points in a bit as well. So when it comes to vendor discovery, you have this entire place. You have social media. You have the different research companies that do the magic listicle or whatever you want to call it. You can ask your peers, and yeah, there are so many ways to discover vendors. So once you have that list, it's time to start working with them. Chances are you've already gotten messages from vendors asking if you want to learn about their product. That usually means that you're ready to it usually means that you can have that working relationship with them already, but also if you haven't spoken to them yet, you check out their website and reach out to them. I'm sure that they'll be eager to work with you immediately. So the important thing here is to be prepared, because once you have that initial conversation, they're going to ask some questions. So here are some frequently asked questions that you might hear from vendors. What is your biggest pain point that the vendor can help with? Usually that's like the first thing that they'll ask. They also ask about scale. So that's like how many developers, how many endpoint services hosts, and that kind of gives you an idea of what their scale, you might want to understand how their pricing model works through these questions as well. And then they ask you about your tech stack, programming languages, and most importantly here, your timeline. So be open to solutions, but tightly scope the requirements so you can control your timeline. What does this mean? So when you put together this vendor evaluation process, and then you work with your proof of concepts, once you start working on your POCs, it's going to take some time to set everything up. There's an increase in complexity once you have more and more vendors that get through the next phase. So you want to scope these out immediately so that your timeline doesn't get too affected by any of these nuances along the way. And lastly, I wanted to mention that some of these questions might require an MNDA. And yeah, so think about it really well, work with your liaisons to answer these questions beforehand, and kind of set those boundaries, because that's going to be really important in you setting the stage for the next step. So when it comes to vendor demonstrations, this one's pretty simple. I'm not even going to go through this too much, but I wanted to mention a few things about these vendor demonstrations. You can learn a lot from the vendors, from understanding what their tools are, understanding what the landscape of security tooling can be, what's out there available for you. And vendors will work with you to understand their tool as well. So you can use demos to get inspired and have a better idea of what you want in a solution. But most importantly, you need to prioritize your defined scope. So here is an example of a vendor evaluation document. Here you have your executive summary, your table of contents, etc., so on and so forth. But there are some key things to this boilerplate document that might be very useful for you. So first off, you want to set the stage for this document. And over here, you can have your definition of requirements as well. And in your definition of requirements, this is where you provide details about your needs. So think about user stories, success criteria, your compliance needs. So given the enterprise that you work in, or any needs that your company might have, you might run into requirements for HIPAA, for example. So you need to make sure that the vendor is HIPAA compliant. And you also want to include the stuff that are, what kind of solutions you're looking for in general, and then define them accordingly. So this could be a pretty long part of the document. So when it comes to open source options, I personally list them differently from vendor solutions, and I can explain that in a little bit. But when it comes to your open source options, you list down a brief description of each project, for example, with features, pros and cons, and other things of note. And when it comes to vendors, you want to include a little bit more information about their pricing model, their deployment model, and sometimes they will also provide the roadmap for you. Honestly, it may be easier to gather data for vendor solutions. So, you put down anything that you find useful for internal deliberations later on. So over here, we have the comparison matrix. This is one of my favorite tables out there that really show leadership, like in a flash, what would be useful for this particular tool. Like you have your different features, for example, just listed over there in one table. And then lastly, before the recommendations, we have the cost estimate. Over here, you kind of want to include licensing, pricing model, and the number of seats that you anticipate would be necessary for this document or for your intended solution. So when it comes to this, whether or not you're evaluating an open source project or a proprietary solution, you want to consider the deployment costs, maintenance costs, and basically any CapEx and OpEx that you might think of. And you want to really include the hidden costs in there, because sometimes you don't think about how long it might take, for example, to run a proof of concept, and then it just keeps going on, and you want to really scope that. So defining it accordingly might help you in the long run to ensure that your costs are under control. And then another thing that I wanted to mention here are the discounts. So when we've spoken before with different vendors, they sometimes will have things that are negotiable, so that includes the cost. So I've seen some publicity discounts out there, multi-year contracts, and other concessions. So don't be afraid to ask when you're working with your vendors for this. So this is an example of what a recommendations page could look like. And really this, let me read them to help visualize things better. If you would like to go with an on-prem deployment, we should go with Company 2. Depending on the budget, we might have to go with Project A, which is open source, and augment it with Company 1's basic offering. Or ideally, we would go with Company Free to save on maintenance costs. Now that you have that document put together, it's time for the proving ground. So over here, you have what we call the proof of concept or the free trial. And the proof of concept, usually you have to set this goal in mind. And more often than not, a free trial would take you about 2 weeks to a month, depending on what you speak with your vendor about. So that's where the timeline comes in. What are you evaluating, and how long are you evaluating it for? And then lastly, success criteria. And this is something that vendors will talk to you about when it comes to your proof of concept. What would you consider a successful proof of concept? I would say that a successful proof of concept would have these things available. So when it comes to the Great Vendor Bake-Off, when you have multiple proofs of concept, for example, you would have your different success criteria, and you can line it up with different priorities. So for example, over here, we list down a deal breaker, and basically any company that couldn't go through that hurdle, unfortunately, will have to be dropped. For criteria B, it's high, but it's still negotiable as compared to a deal breaker. But if some other company has, if some other solution rather has a better list of these criteria that they fulfill, then they're probably going to get ahead. But of course, criteria plus cost, there's a lot to, that you have to deliberate on. And that's where this comes in. Basically, this is when you speak with your leadership about the different tools, how much they cost, what the recommendations are, along with your vendor evaluation document. So let's say we've picked a tool, and we already have. So it's time to go at the speed of business. This is about the time where you work mostly with legal, finance, all of the reviewers, etc. And one of the things they might ask from you is a business justification. So for us, what a business justification looked like has been an executive summary with explanation of what the business objective is. We showcase the different options, pros and cons if applicable, just to show that we've done our due diligence when it comes to picking a tool. And then we mention the pricing, cost projection, and the return on investment, and briefly describe these implementation costs. So how much of this is actually overhead versus a maintenance cost, for example. And then add your recommendations and conclusion at the end. But another thing that isn't on this page is engineer testimony and opinions. So I highly believe that when it comes to working with your developers, you want to bring them into the proof of concept as well. So during the proof of concept, once you gather your engineer's testimony and opinions, you might want to throw it in the business justification document, showing them qualitative reasons as to why this tool should be chosen. And then contract negotiations and review happen. Your mileage may vary. This happens very differently in varying companies. So we're just going to talk about how to help with this process. So first of all, speed of business may be different for each company, depending on how large it is or how distributed it is, etc. So it's going to be very different depending where you are or what time of the year it is. So regularly scheduled check-ins with your procurement stakeholders are going to be really important here, because some things might fall through the cracks, and sometimes there are some reviews that you must have done that you did not do. Therefore, you have to make sure that you're doing everything in your court and then pass it on to them. So, just to make sure that things are moving along in your internal processes, You also want to have a checklist of sorts and to follow up with them. Another thing that you want to think about are the different reviews that you have. So for example, legal reviews, financial reviews, and privacy reviews. Now it's time to work with the development teams, and this is in preparation for the implementation and rollout section. First off, you need to get your engineering leaders buy-in. Luckily, you know what, we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but I also wanted to mention that when it comes to engineering leaders buy-in, it's really helpful for you to work with your leadership as well. And then you can work with your DevSecOps enablement platform engineering partners, work with their TPMs to get the ball rolling, and then facilitate the developer awareness portion of these side of things. So we are going through this through 3 different lenses: engineering leaders, DevSecOps enablement platform engineering, and then the developers at large. So when it comes to getting your engineering leaders buy-in, your mileage may vary. This is an example of a hierarchical process or a hierarchy of employees. And you know, the report chain might be a little bit strict here, and it's very top-down when it comes to the key objectives, key results, if you're familiar with OKRs. So in this case, you'd like to do both levels here. You want to have cross-functional conversations between, you know, let's say if you're the IC, you work with the IC of the other team while you get the leaders of both your teams to talk to each other as well. And these are some things that you'll want to talk about, or the business leaders would like to talk about. So business goal alignment. When you're working with your CISO to talk to the VP of engineering, for example, you'll want to get their goals aligned with each other, get the CISO to explain to the VP or SVP, what have you, the particular business goal in mind that you think would align these 2 objectives of yours. You want to mention that there will be costs. So engineering leaders will definitely ask about how much it would cost for their team to work with you. So that's something that you'll need to prepare for. Ownership and responsibilities. Definitely, you know, that's one thing that you should not forget, because when it comes down to putting together the entire process and rollout, it will have to be owned by someone. Like a particular process has to be owned by someone, or a particular tool has to be owned by someone, or else nobody owns it. And then you get into a bit of a bad place. But yeah, basically in this, some of the things that you'll want to discuss are these, so that the leaders can get on each other's roadmap. And then we have the DevSecOps enablement platform engineering teams. They have a 360 view of the infrastructure. They have their TPMs, for example. Hopefully they do have TPMs on your team as well. So learn from them the ins and outs of the system you are integrating with. So what does this mean? Basically, you want to go there, probably go through some of their introductory courses for some of their engineers even, maybe put your ICs under them for a little bit to understand how everything works. And then also, when it comes to technical discussions with a vendor, you might want to consider having these folks in the room as well, because these people know the system, and therefore they will get a quick vibe check to see whether or not this all works for you, for your company rather. So, developer awareness and education. When it comes to this stuff, I was a little vague with this slide. I think that when it comes down to it, you'll want to work with the experts on developer education and awareness. So you'll want to incentivize them so that they want to engage with you. And more importantly, this is how you get them to do it, how you get your developers to take action. Documentation is key, and not just any documentation. I'm talking about documentation that tells them how to do a thing, what exactly they need to do, and why. So you want to put these processes in place and then write runbooks about them. So writing a runbook, for example, for the application security tool that you are implementing is going to be very, very important here because they will eventually have to work with that tool. Make developers aware what is expected of them as well. Now, once you're prepared to talk to them about these things and everyone's on board, you'll want to plan the technical implementation as well. So this includes the glue code that you need to put together. And visualize this tool and how it will work in the entire ecosystem of AppSec tools that you have in place, or more than just AppSec, actually. And then you want to plant ownership of that technical implementation as well. So not only is it useful for you to have that ownership and responsibilities from the engineering leaders part, it's also useful to have ownership of those particular action items that you need to take place when you do your technical implementation. So if you haven't heard of RACI before, it stands for Responsible, Accountable, Consulted, and Informed. And this is a framework which you can use to figure out who does what exactly, or what are they supposed to do in that particular initiative. Okay, so finally, we have the implementation and rollout. And this is going to be really fun from an engineering and developer experience perspective. So this time, you're about to break ground. Are you prepared? Probably not yet. Because whether or not you're architecting your implementation early on or later on, you need to also plan your rollout. So planning next steps includes, putting together a rollout plan. That includes the priority, the scope, and the launch strategies that you'd like to use to employ. There's also the findings remediation plan, and this basically tells you what exactly it is that you need to do once you have a finding. So all in all, you need to plan your next steps here. Once you figure out that this thing is done, then what? And so on and so forth. So going back to launch strategies for AppSec tooling, there are different ways for you to do so. One of which is you can start off with a pilot group and increase rollout coverage over time. Later on, I'll give you a little bit of examples of pilot groups that would make, like teams that make really good pilot groups. And then also, there's this thing called dark launch. So over here in dark launch, you want to start in quiet mode and then make sure things aren't breaking. Once you figure out that things aren't breaking, then you can turn it on basically, but we'll get there. So these are just some strategies that might work for you. Okay, so don't bite off more than you can chew is basically one of the launch strategies that I just talked about earlier. I wanted to let y'all know about this little story that I had with regards to biting off more than you can chew. So imagine, we roll out this tool, we think it's great, we needed this immediately, and then we roll it out, only to find out that, wait, we needed to do some fine-tuning beforehand. And it's really painful, apparently, to go for breadth instead of depth. what really worked for us later on was that we did fine tuning early on before we actually rolled it out to a lot of teams. Because it's really costly to roll out every single time. So yeah, prioritization is really key here. So for one, critical applications usually want to be first in line once you start operationalizing. But more or less, you want to start with the easy wins to kickstart your coverage area and prove the tool is worth its weight early. So the way to do this is to consider phased rollouts, starting with resilient teams that can provide good feedback. So an example of this team would be your developer experience team, for example. You know, these people will be able to point you in the right direction to figure out who can provide good feedback, who probably doesn't have too much on their plate at the moment. I know it's hard given, you know, there's a lot of initiatives going on, but there will be one or two teams out there that will be willing to work with you on this more than their other counterparts would be able to do so at that current time. So with these teams, you can gather feedback and other data along the way and make this an agile process. So you want to consider doing that proof of concept with them, basically, and maybe gather their feedback early on in the process. Okay, so next, we're going to talk about operationalization. This really is just as a slide where it shows, you know, you can flip the switch and everything should just work. However, I do know that that's not usually the case. Live demos, for example, don't just work. And you need to have a plan B in place. So when it comes for the time to get out of quiet mode, hopefully you've figured out all your little nuances here and there will be some edge cases that get caught on as well. Let's say you have a SaaS that was deployed for some applications, and apparently there was this edge case that, you know, there was this particular language or framework that also needed to be taken into consideration. So when it comes to those things, you might have to go back and do some more alignment with these other teams. So again, it goes back to my previous story where you'll want to basically work quickly. You'll want to work quickly with some teams and then kind of fine tune it accordingly before you get out of quiet mode. But let's see here. Even before operationalization, you should have been gathering metrics. But this time around, it's live data. So you'll want to have a plan so that you can ensure that you can align the project with the OKRs that you have in your company, remembering what your purpose is, and you define your metrics accordingly. To be honest, this feels like I'm preaching to the choir here, but you know, I think that this slide really just goes to show that we need to align with our business when it comes to these metrics. And what more can we get out of metrics? Well, we can try to answer some of these questions. How long does it take for development teams to learn about new findings in their applications? How many findings are being resolved versus being discovered over time? What percentage of all applications have scanners installed? What about critical applications, for example? So some of these are just questions that you can ask to figure out the metrics that you need. But really, there are other questions that you can ask as well. For example, Are the developers happy with the AppSec tool? And this goes back to developer experience. One story that I've heard multiple times is that developers might not even like the tool in the first place, and it provides a lot of friction for the developers. Therefore, they're more likely to take down the tool, either disable it or complain about it. And when we think about these AppSec tools, we also need to think about the developer happiness, because they are kind of one of the end users of this tool. They are going to be they are going to be affected by our decisions with which tool we go with. But with these metrics, you can determine your next steps, which could really be just doing this process anew in a different context. This framework was something that we basically put together in my team to figure out, vendor selection, procurement, and implementation. And hopefully, what you can take out of this, aside from the framework, is that you can go and ask your team, what problems do we need to solve? Look around the RSA conference for inspiration. You're already here. Why not? It's only Monday. In 3 months, you can set aside time to learn about new technologies and kick off vendor evaluations. And in 6 months, you can improve your relationships with key vendors and implement proofs of concept. Now, the reason why I included this is because technology, when it comes to cybersecurity especially, is always evolving. And I'm pretty sure there is going to be something new aside from AI next year. It's really important for folks to remember that there are going to be new challenges, especially in this particular time where AI is really booming. So given all of that, it's really useful for us to understand these new technologies, whether it be through learning from a vendor or going to these conferences. Learning is everlasting for this industry, I think. Anyway, I'll leave this with you, and thank you. I am now open to questions. We do have a couple of microphones here and there on each aisle, so please. And thank you.
Do you have any tactics for dealing where you're looking at solving 2 or 3 problems at once, say ASPM and CSPM and CNAP, where a vendor may cover one area better than the other but delve into the other areas? How do you deal with a cross-architectural vendor selection process? Have you ever had to deal with a problem like that?
Okay, so when it comes to ASPM, CSPM, and CNAP, for example, there are going to be different, there are going to be overlaps, and even outside of those tools, there will be overlaps in product offerings, given that, honestly, a lot of vendors are trying to do very similar things. What I've found is that it's very useful to kind of, one, set your boundaries. So if you absolutely just want this, you'll want to think about just that part, just that product offering when it comes to working with that particular vendor, but keeping yourself open to the other things. So for example, in the vendor evaluation document, one of the things that I included was a list of vendor offerings product offerings from a particular vendor. What I did afterwards was set up that matrix, that comparison matrix, for each product that the vendor had. And then that way you can weigh them accordingly. And then to the other point that I wanted to make with these tools is that I really think that when it comes to all of the new technologies that are being put together out there, there are going to be some offerings or some vendors that have done this like way more in the past, and you want to kind of figure out, did this vendor do this just because? Are they further along in their development process, or some other heuristic that you can make is, has this vendor actually done their due diligence in putting this product together in such a way that it will work for us? Not to throw too much shade on some vendors, but I have noticed that there's a lot of like existing technologies out there, or like existing product offerings that are still very early in the market. And just because someone said that, hey, we have an ASPM in place, that doesn't mean that their depth is as heavy or as well established as another tool. So you want to think about it from that perspective as well. Not just because you have one-stop shop for everything doesn't mean that it's the best tool for you. Thank you.
I do have a question for you as well. I have a viewpoint. I face similar problem that he just explained and how I tackled it, but I will come to that later on. My question to you is, while making things easy for our developers, what we decided is to invest more time to make things look like they belong to them, rather than putting burden on them. For an example, for AST vulnerabilities, instead of them going to the new portal, what we did, we kind of integrated with their existing supply chains and their existing CI/CD pipelines, so that every vulnerability you found that is a validated one comes up as a story, so that they can include them in their sprints. But the problem is, it took a lot of time from our side. And over the time, the problem that we faced is now developers expect us to do it every time. Every time we onboard something, they expect us to make it look their style, like the developer style. And it takes a lot of time. So I don't know if you ever witnessed something like this, but I don't know what the solution is, because their expectations are that every time we onboard something, we make it look like it's their tool.
Okay, this sounds like a culture thing, and I think it's great that you already have something put in place. I think when it comes to educating developers on a new process, like if you want to do things a little bit differently, you'll want to work with your developer education partners. If you have a DevX team, I think that they would be one of the best people to work with regards to testing this out. So earlier I mentioned, doing a small rollout first and then kind of fine-tuning it before sending it out to other folks. What you can basically do the same thing here. I think that it might work for you if you try to roll it out to just a small team and then see how they react to that new feature. Or when it comes to UX testing, for example, even if you just present them with mock-ups or have some sort of like user conversation with them, just talk to them, I think.
All right, thank you.
All right, I guess we're at time. Thank you, everyone.